Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last lesson on the politics of Elizabethan England. Today we're looking at an almost comically disastrous attempt made by the Earl of Essex, Lord Robert Devereux, to take power within the Privy Council in 1601. We will tackle the following points. First, who was this Earl of Essex? 2, how he fell from favour in the court. 3, what were his aims in his rebellion? 4, the rebellion itself. And finally, the conclusion and the model answer. So let's start with the beginning. Who was the Earl of Essex? Robert Devereux, first Earl of Essex, was one of the favourites of Queen Elizabeth and one of the most influential courtiers in the last years of the 16th century. The Privy Council was, like every political institution with more than 2 people, divided into several factions, and in the system of patronage, remember that we looked in the previous lessons, these factions depended on the goodwill of its most important members for favours and for economic success. So a faction was as powerful as its most important member, from whom all the favours and privileges descended. There were 2 factions which, at the end of the Elizabethan period, vied for dominance in the council. The soldier adventurers, led by Essex, who were usually young knights and noblemen with a military background, who pushed for an aggressive foreign policy against Spain and for a more radical Puritanism in terms of religion. And then there was the administrators faction, who were civil servants and members of the gentry who tended to advocate a more cautious and moderate approach to all matters, religion, internal policy, and so on. They were led by Robert Cecil, who was the son of William Cecil. Remember, we discussed William Cecil when talking about the Privy Council. He was the power behind the throne, the grey eminence in the Elizabethan government. He died in 1597, and he had a son, Robert Cecil, who took his place as the faction leader within the council. Another important thing that we need to talk about in order to understand Essex's rebellion was the culture of honour in the 16th century. The honour of a man, the way he was respected by other people, was the most important thing they could have, and their honour was threatened. When their honour was threatened, most noblemen would do things that to us look aggressive and stupid, but for them they were not. For the time, they were the commonly accepted way to respond to slights and offences. So there will be a few times, as I narrate the Rebellion of Essex, in which you will say, "What was he thinking?" And this is the answer. This is what was he thinking. He was trying to reaffirm his honour and his reputation in the way a man in the 16th century would do that, by being aggressive and violent and noisy and boisterous to an extent that to us seems almost ridiculous. But this is the point. The past is a foreign land and they do things differently there. So let's look at how he fell from favour. There will be a chronology, a detailed chronology in the transcript, so look at that as well. We said that Essex was a favourite, okay, of the Queen, a person who had full access to the Queen and to her patronage. As such, and due to his bold and dashing behaviour, he was seen as the ideal candidate to lead an army against some Irish rebels in 1598. He did, however, lack the qualities of a good general: organisation, patience, ability to predict the moves of the enemy, and in general he was a pretty lousy commander, with a pretty lousy army, because as we will see when talking about the Spanish Armada, the English army during this time was possibly the weakest among the great powers in Europe, if England can be seen as a great power by this stage. And despite starting, compared to the Irish rebel, with a stronger and well-supplied army, he was soon forced to sign a truce with the Irish leader. Now, Elizabeth sent him there not to sign a peace, but to defeat the Irish, to crush them. So she did not like this, not one bit. He recalled Essex to London, where he was removed from his command post. For him, this was a mortal offence to his honour, mortal offence number 1. Then he heard that one of the members of Cecil's faction had been granted a privilege instead of one of his own faction, and this is mortal offense to his honor, number 2. And all of this was done by a woman. Even though she was the queen, she was still a woman. And in the mind of a man of the 16th century, this multiplied the effect of the previous mortal offenses by a factor of 10, okay? So for him, being offended in this way by a woman, even though she was the queen, was incredibly important and an incredible damage to his own honor as a person. Furious, Essex reacted by storming the chamber of the Queen when he was in London before she was properly dressed and wigged, okay? It was a huge form of disrespect to an almost sacred figure. Essex just stormed in the chambers of the Queen while she was still in her nightgown, without a wig, without a makeup, the way, in a natural, well, she was looking natural, and she was not supposed to look natural. She was the Queen. She was supposed to look perfect. She was supposed to look sacred, okay? It was a huge lack of respect towards the Queen. And this was not the first time he had done something similar. In a few years before, in 1595, in order to prove his honor, he even half unsheathed his sword after the Queen jokingly slapped him on the ear. Now, literally anyone else in this position would have been summarily tried and then killed. But Essex was a powerful man with powerful friends. They interceded for him at the court and convinced the Queen to be merciful. He was removed from office and put under house arrest, and that was it. An actually very mild sentence for such a huge offence. That is, until in June 1600 he was allowed to go free, but on one condition. The Queen had taken away his monopoly on the sale of sweet wine. Bit of a throwback to our lesson on the royal court. It was the place where privileges were given to the favorites, okay? And one of the most sought after privileges was a trade monopoly, the ability to sell or produce exclusively certain goods. So only Essex could sell or earn from the sale of sweet wine. No one else. It was a huge market and a huge sign of his position at court. Okay? And this was not just financially crippling, since most of his money came from that monopoly, but also it was yet another mortal offense to his honor, okay? Because in order to prove their honor to their subordinates, to people underneath them, 16th century nobles were almost required to live above their means, to show off the wealth constantly. Without money, he would not be able to show off and therefore obtain the respect that he so desperately craved. Because, again, 16th century had a honor culture that was very strong, but I think Robert Devereux was in himself a man who was obsessed by this, which led him to do this rash and uncalculated actions. So to sum it up, he fell from favor because of his lackluster performance in the Irish War, because he disrespected the Queen, and eventually the tipping point for him was when the monopoly of sweet wine was revoked, and saw him as the last straw. Okay, this is that. As we said, this was it. In his mind, the fault of his downfall was not due to his rash and uncontrollable behavior, but to the machination of his enemy Cecil. Okay, he had to get rid of Cecil and take power within the Privy Council. He was angry at Elizabeth too, but he could not replace her, since he did not have royal blood. Being the king, being the monarch at the time, was not like being the prime minister, that literally anyone, if you get elected, could be prime minister. You needed to have royal blood. You needed to be part of a certain bloodline, because the kingdom was the property of that family. The same way a family now could own a house, at the time, the royal family essentially owned the title of Kings of England. A civil war happens when no one is sure who inherits a title. Okay, it's like a dispute after someone in a family dies and nobody knows who gets the house. So he didn't have royal blood, but he could change who was actually in power. Change by putting himself in power. Furthermore, Elizabeth at this time was old. She had ruled for about 40 years. I don't know exactly how old she was. I think in the late 60s. So pretty old for the 16th century. And her successor would be very soon on the throne. And Essex thought that if his faction was in control of the council, he would be well placed to become the most powerful and honourable man in the entire British Isles. Not just England, because James was also the King of Scotland. So if he was in the good graces of Scotland, he would be absolutely number one in the entire British Isles, a dream come true for a man obsessed with honour. So what did he do? And this is where stupidity, I think, in my personal opinion, starts being excessive even for the honour culture of the 16th century. So with a typically rash gesture, Essex decided to announce to everybody who had ears that he wanted to do, that he was about to do something. He paid a company of actors, the Chamberlain's Men, the one where Shakespeare worked, to perform a play titled Richard II. Now, the plot is complicated but can be summarized in a few sentences. A king, the title character Richard II, followed the advice of some evil counselor and then dies. It was a clear message for anyone who had ears to listen. Something was wrong with the current council and someone was about to fix it. Now, if you were the Queen, you would be a bit concerned, because it was a political statement like saying a revolution will happen sooner or later. So the Queen sent two people to investigate, who very shortly after discovered that Essex had paid for the play. They went to his palace, asking him for some clarification, because why would he do that? But got kidnapped instead by a panicking Essex who didn't expect things to go down this fast. He saw the men of the Queen, just panicked, locked them down in his own house, and then set off to activate his plan. He gathered his men, most of whom he himself had knighted, had made into knights during the Irish campaign, and who therefore owed him favours, again patronage, and decided that together they would occupy the city of London, not the entire city, but the buildings where the Lord Mayors resided and the places of power inside the city of London, the Tower of London, where political prisoners were held and which was a symbol of royal power, and the royal court. This is a very common strategy among people who want to overthrow a government, this idea of occupying certain strategic places of power where the decisions are taken physically. However, in his rashness, since his plan had been activated sooner than he had realized, Essex didn't realize two important things. First, the resistance was stronger than he had thought, and the Lord Mayor had immediately declared him a traitor. Second, his supporters were not as steadfast as he hoped. They were not as faithful and loyal as he hoped. As soon as things got tough, as soon as the Queen's men started to gather in order to respond to this rebellion, his men left him. And he was then forced to run back to his palace, and the Queen's soldiers found him there and arrested him while he was trying to burn some incriminating evidence in the chimney. After 12 days, on the 20th of February, he was put under trial and publicly beheaded on the 25th of February in 1601. So, for some reason it doesn't load the next. Okay, for some reason it didn't load the last page of the transcript. For some reason, that's a bug from Microsoft Word. So, what can we say in conclusion? What does the Essex Rebellion tell us about Elizabethan England? Actually, quite a lot. First, honor culture was very strong among the English nobility and could lead to rebellions, especially if a queen, not a king, was on the throne. Two, Despite having ruled successfully for more than 40 years, Elizabeth still had a strong internal opposition. She was, however, able to deal with them quickly and effectively. Third, when Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, came to power, the main threat to the crown were the nobles. Okay? They lived outside London, they had their own fiefs and their own castles and their own private armies. Now, almost as more than a century later actually, now that the nobles had been tamed, that the nobles did not have the big big and scary private armies as they had before, the main threat to the stability of the kingdom were the people who struggled for power within the monarch's inner circle, either the Privy Council or the court, meaning that the state was growing more centralized. Now, the place where power was held was not the periphery of the kingdom, but the center, the court. And this is a huge change compared to the medieval past of England, where power was decentralized. Now, I will read the model answer, and hopefully this will help you to write your own answer to the question. So let me get some water. It's in a bottle of wine, but it's water, I swear. Now, the Essex Rebellion was an attempt by Lord Robert Devereux to challenge the power of Cecil's faction in the Privy Council in 1601, in order to be well placed when the Queen died and her successors came to the throne. Lord Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was an important member of the Privy Council and the leader of one of the two major factions within the council. He led the so-called Soldiers' Adventurers, a group of young courtiers with a military background who pushed for a more aggressive foreign policy against Spain. His main enemy was Robert Cecil, the son of William Cecil, and the leader of the Administrators faction, a group that advised moderation in foreign, religious and internal policies. After his lackluster performance against the Irish rebels in 1599, Essex was recalled to the court of the Queen. He saw this as an act of disrespect and became even more furious when a few weeks later a member of Cecil's faction was promoted instead of one of his own men. He showed his anger by entering the chambers of the Queen before she was properly dressed and wigged. This kind of behavior would have caused anyone else to be beheaded, but Essex was very influential and he was only punished with house arrest. This was the beginning of his decline. He lost his position at court and eventually also his monopoly on the sale of sweet wine, which granted him the majority of his income. He began to believe that Cecil was behind all this and he started to plot to replace him. He also knew that Elizabeth was old and that she would die soon. If he got power within the council before her death, he would be well placed to become the favourite of her successors, James I. In February 1601, he asked a company of actors to play a Shakespeare drama titled Richard II, in which a king who follows the advice of his evil courtiers got deposed by his lords. It was a clear political message which announced everyone his intentions. The next day, he kidnapped the two men the Queen had sent him, asking for an explanation. Feeling threatened, he gathered his followers and tried to take control of some key locations in London. The Lord Mayor of London, however, did not feel intimidated and declared him an outlaw and a traitor. His support soon evaporated. He was arrested, put on trial, and beheaded. The Essex Rebellion is significant because it shows us two things: that at the end of her reign, Elizabeth still had some opposition, but also loyal supporter, and that unlike in the early Tudor period, the main enemies of a monarch were not the nobles with their private armies, but courtiers and favourites who moved within the inner circle of a queen. Okay then, that's it for today. I'm looking forward to read your answers to the questions, and see you next time.